One of the biggest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century was the uncovering of the tomb of King Tutankhamun, or known as King Tut for short, which happened in Egypt during the early 1920s. The discovery was remarkable because there were thousands among thousands of ancient tombs in Egypt, but during the years many had been plundered and robbed. So the odds of finding an untouched tomb in the early 20th century were very slim. So you can imagine the excitement of the scientists and archaeologists as they unearthed the steps down into the tomb, unsealed the door, and entered a place where no one had been for over 3,000 years. Not only did they find the mummified body of King Tut, but many ancient artifacts were found as well that tell us a lot about the life of this ancient ruler and about the ancient Egyptian civilization. Because of the discovery of the tomb, King Tut had become a common name, but before that, he was largely forgotten by the world. Now, I think that our school system has done a really good job during the years of cultivating an extreme dislike among students of all things history. And even in our own household, we deal with this. And people wonder, why do I have to waste my time learning names and dates of people that have no relevance to my life at all? Well, the fact is, this discovery in the early 1900s was great to that end because it sparked a mass renewal in interest in ancient civilizations. And during the 60s, many of these artifacts were actually taken on a world tour and were seen by millions of people in many major cities. They saw these things that had remained in such pristine condition even though they were 3 millennia old. Now, in his tomb were things like statues, jars, hunting implements, even a board game, and the popular golden burial mask. You probably have seen that somewhere along the way. And when we see these things, we may wonder, why were all these things placed in this tomb? When we bury a dead body, we put the body in a coffin, and maybe there would be a wedding ring or a piece of jewelry, or sadly, if it's a child, a small stuffed animal, something like that, but nothing extravagant. Why would they have all of these things in there? Well, that goes back to the importance of studying history. And we study it to learn about our ancestors, which broadens our perspective on our own lives, since we eventually have come from them. So the reason that they put these artifacts in this tomb was for religious purposes primarily. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians were correct in their belief in an afterlife, that after this world is over, we go on to somewhere else. They were actually correct about that. However, their belief in the afterlife was flawed because they thought you could take all these treasures with you and use them into the next world. Hunting implements, I guess you would be bored in heaven or wherever, so you'd need a board game to play. That's what they thought. Well, not only the ancient Egyptians were guilty of this flawed belief, but this permeated pagan thought in general. Jesus knew this, so when he was preaching the Sermon on the Mount, he warned his listeners not to fall in that same trap. He didn't want the people listening to act as if and live their lives as if they can amass all this stuff to take with them when they leave this world. And the Bible doesn't tell us a whole lot about heaven either. And I think a big reason for that is because heaven is so glorious and majestic that it's really hard to describe that in mere human words. So, if the Christian believes he can take anything into the next world, he is selling heaven short, because heaven is so much better than anything that we could have or could experience here. In chapter 6 of the book of Matthew is where we see Jesus' words about storing up treasures. And we'll be looking at verses 19 through 24, which are on the screen as always. Jesus said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The lamp of the body is the eye. If therefore your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If therefore the light that is in you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon." May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and to the hearing of His holy word. These are only 6 verses, but there's an awful lot in there, a lot of ways you can look at it. You can talk about financial responsibility. You can talk about putting God first in all areas of your life. You can even talk about Christian stewardship, a number of other things. But these are all driven by the condition of your heart. If your heart is with God, then all these things will be much more possible for you. You'll be more likely to be financially responsible, more likely to put God first, and more likely to exercise better stewardship of your resources. As I'm sure you all know, I deal with numbers and dollars and financial figures pretty much all day long. I don't shy away from talking about money when it is appropriate. I do hear some people in the church who tend to be a little afraid of mentioning the subject of money because they think people are going to take it the wrong way. People don't want to feel like they have to give more in the offering, or they don't want to be told how to handle their money. And it's a good thing for you. I'm not going to talk about those things this morning. But I will say Jesus frequently did talk about those things. In verse 21, he says, "For where your treasure is your money, basically, in our society, there your heart will be also." And this is a verse that has been twisted and misinterpreted for quite some time. I'm reminded of a politician, hard to believe, from this century who will remain nameless to protect the guilty. And this person once in a speech quoted this verse, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And he used, it is a he, can't get around that gender pronoun there. He used it as support for stricter environmental regulations. And his reasoning was that his heart was with the environment, so it was his duty to use his treasure or his wealth to support environmentally protecting organizations and so forth. So if we also treasure the environment, that's where we should put our money too. The problem with his logic is that this is an example, and I have a visitor up here. Hi, Mr. Ladybug. Anyway. He's off my word there. Problem with his logic is that this is an example how you can proof text and pull a verse out where it's not and misinterpret it the way it's not meant to be. All you have to do is read the very prior verse in Matthew 6 and see that Jesus is instructing his followers to store up treasures in heaven. Now, the last time I checked, our environment out here is not heaven. And I'm glad that it's not, because heaven is a lot better than what we see out here. Jesus is not talking about environmental regulations in the Sermon on the Mount. As Christians, we should be good stewards of the environment. No problem with that. That's just not what he's talking about here. So sadly, this politician was twisting Scripture to promote his own agenda. Jesus is talking about our heart more than anything else, and how we often use our treasure, our money, our dollars to improve our status on earth when we really should be using it for the glory of God instead. It won't surprise you to hear that conventional wisdom tells us if we have more money, we will then live more comfortably and will therefore be happier. And to an extent that is true. But back in 2012, there was an edition of Forbes magazine which featured a very good piece by Dr. Robert Glatter, and he explained the connection between money and happiness. And it would make sense that earning a certain amount of money would bring you a certain amount of happiness. So therefore, based on my little chart up here, if you have more money, you have more happiness. And we think that it equates no matter how much you earn. So what Dr. Glatter's study determined is that the person who earns $50,000 a year versus a person who earns $25,000 a year is not twice as happy. Actually, at this income level, he determined that they are only 9% happier. So if they ask the person who earns $25,000 on a scale of 1 to 20, what's your happiness? They on average said, I'm an 11. They asked the person who's earning $50,000 on that same scale, what's your happiness? 9% more is just, they rated it a 12. So you are working a lot harder to earn that extra $25,000 for just very minimal incremental happiness. Now, Jesus is telling us, isn't he? Having more money, more treasure, more stuff isn't necessarily worth it. The heart, your heart, should not be tied to these things because you're setting yourself up for great disappointment. You're working hard, yet you're not any happier. But the study wasn't finished. Dr. Glatter concluded that actually most Americans' level of happiness maxes out when you're earning $75,000 a year. Honestly, I thought it would have been higher than that. So it says that the person who's earning $75,000 a year is just as happy as a person who just won the multi-million-dollar Powerball jackpot, in the long run anyway. That's what casino operators, people who run get-rich-quick schemes, don't want you to know. They want you to think you're going to be so much better, but even if you win that big prize, you're no happier than an upper middle-class family. Dr. Glatter ended his piece with a great way to apply his findings to our lives, and I can't say it any better than he did. He writes, a more extreme but scientifically proven means of increasing the happiness you derive from your money is a bit more radical, not spending it on yourself. It turns out that people who spend money on others rather than themselves are actually happier in the long run. They derive a greater feeling of reward and satisfaction, and this helps to enrich their inner feelings of sharing and contentment. So instead of buying that extra watch or TV the next time you have some newfound money, consider the alternative, indulging less and offering others the opportunity to share in your wealth. End quote. Question is, what is it you treasure the most? What are you looking to for contentment? The things of this world will never completely satisfy us. I want to hurt the little guy. The study shows that the more you have, your less incremental happiness will be. It's one of the many reasons why we are called to lay up our treasures in heaven and not on earth. Jesus is giving us advice here in the Sermon on the Mount of how to live a happy life. And a lot of that involves how we use our money. Dr. Glatter's study confirms what we've known all along, and that's that Jesus was right. We are happier when we are more generous towards others, and we are not as happy when we are hoarding everything to ourselves and not giving Him the glory through the things we have. Now in verses 22 and 23, he talks about the lamp of the body, and if your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light, but if your eyes are unhealthy, then your whole body will be full of darkness. Can you see the benefit of serving the Lord here and putting Him first? You can if His light is in you and if that light is guiding you. Remember, if you will, the story back in the Old Testament, Joshua chapter 7, the story of Achan's sin. In a nutshell, the story was God had led the Israelites to a massive military victory over the Babylonians, but He strictly forbade them from taking any spoil from the Babylonians, because this was not a typical war where you go in and kill people and take their stuff. This was God's judgment on them, so if He allowed the Israelites to take anything, it would be cheapening what He was trying to do. However, a man named Achan takes some of the spoil, and it was found out. And what happened was he was stoned to death as punishment. This is another instance where when individuals act on their desire for earthly treasures, when it's not in God's will for them to have it, it can have disastrous results. And this isn't just a picture of this wrathful Old Testament God. In the New Testament, we see more of the same. We go to the book of Acts. Acts chapter 4, the great communism chapter. People use that. That's a joke, by the way, because communism is not in the Bible. But the great communism chapter, where everyone sold everything and everyone shared everything and lived happily ever after. We read of husband and wife duo Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. Unlike Achan, who stole for his own gain, this couple veiled their theft as a sale for charity. They saw how Barnabas and all these other great disciples were getting attention for selling their property and giving to everyone. Well, Bonnie and Clyde, or Ananias and Sapphira, whatever, they wanted the same attention and the same adoration. So they sold a piece of property to benefit the church, let everyone think they were giving 100% to the church, but held some back. Peter goes and confronts them, each separately. They lie about it. He says that you not only lied to me, but you've lied to the Holy Spirit, and they die instantly. Look at what each of these, Ananias, Sapphira, and Achan, all learned. That their choice to pursue treasures on earth on their own terms, they lost their lives because of it. That's why Jesus closes out this short passage by saying, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. And realize money by and of itself is not evil. It's not a bad thing. It's simply a medium of exchange. Let's say tomorrow everyone decides instead of using dollar bills, we will use M&Ms, and that's what we're going to pay for things with. We're going to say that they have some kind of value other than their chocolatey goodness. And if we would change our currency to M&Ms, M&Ms don't all of a sudden become evil, okay? It's all still about what's in our hearts, whether we are going to use them for good or evil purposes. Back to King Tut now. At the beginning I said we study history in order to indirectly learn more about ourselves. There's a lot more to King Tut than knowing things about him, like he took the throne at age 9, or he died at the age of 19 because of an infection from a broken leg and malaria. Okay, who would have thought? The most important knowledge about King Tut is the artifacts that are buried with him. They are the roadmap that tells us about his view of the afterlife, how he believed that he could take it all with him into the next life. This contrasts with the true faith. And we read this in the book of Job about a man who lived before King Tut did. And we read about him that once he fell to the ground in worship and said, naked from my mother's womb I came, and naked I will depart. Jesus confirms that Job was correct. You can't take anything with you when you depart from this world, but it doesn't mean that this life serves no purpose at all. Actually, this life is of the utmost importance because Jesus instructs us to spend our time here preparing for the next. When we do this by storing up treasures in heaven. And these are the best treasures because they will never be destroyed, never be stolen, never be lost. Take a look inside your heart and make sure that Jesus is there. He is the one who will direct your efforts. Where are you laying up your treasures? Even secular studies tell us that the more we earn, the more and more difficult it's going to be happy with what we have. The good news is we can counteract this by being more generous and giving to those in need at the direction of the Lord. It is the ultimate win-win situation because the recipient of your generosity is happy for receiving, you are happy for giving, and the Lord is happy that you've done this in His name. I guess that actually makes it a win-win-win. It's all because you've chosen to store up treasures in heaven rather than on earth. Let us now go to Him in prayer.